Hello everyone, question and answer video today. This is a relatively old one from I think 6 months ago or more, but I tend to cover everything, just there are some logics that I cannot immediately explicitate in the way I organized the Q&A. However, say the more complex and interesting questions will receive a video. I can fish them back from several months back. I don't forget, right? That's a quality of mine. May not eventually make the video for a long time, but I don't forget that they are in store. So this was sent to Schwerpunkt's email by a very staunch and loyal follower of mine that poses really a challenging point regarding many topics. I don't know how long this video will be, but let's address this, because overall it's a relatively straightforward and simple question, but of course simplest things are the most difficult in many ways, as von Clausewitz also teaches us. So hello Schwerpunkt, I hope this season of Christmas, this was from December the 13th, 2024, finds you in good health. Whenever I find myself in a period of reflection, as is associated with Christmas and Easter, I am inevitably drawn back to Schwerpunkt, and I have begun a renewed effort to partake in and understand your content once again. The standard which is set by your channel is not found anywhere else on YouTube, and I must tell you that I essentially exclusively use YouTube as a means to watch your channel at this point. Positive development in my eyes. It is not exclusively the holiday season that drew me back to the imperial Catholic and apostolic tradition, however. Recently I was given the great privilege of conducting military funeral honors for fallen soldiers and veterans of the U.S. Army. Alright, so this guy's in the military, by the way. At some point he told me he tried to listen in the Marines, and I don't remember the follow-up, but he's in the military, and here it's not really discussed, but as far as I understood, I had a big role in sort of bringing him that direction, and he, in fact, carries out this funerary honors for the veterans of the U.S. Army, which is very interesting, and of course the question has to do with this. I will not comment the general background, because here I'm interested in the question, but you know what this guy says in general, in other emails is very interesting, and it's not the first time. In fact, we made a Q&A based on one of his emails. So continuing this one, the initial spark that rekindled my interest and set me back to being a hardcore watcher of Schwerpunkt was thinking about the decursio and the traditional meaning of the Roman military funeral honors as compared to the very same ceremonies that I am conducting. So you remember what the decursio is, right? We talked about this in the videos about the Roman tradition. It was the imperial funeral where basically all the knights circled around the burning pyre, throwing their own decorations, their insignia into the fire. That, in that sense, represented the Indo-European transfiguring, purifying, holy fire, bringing the transfigured soul of the victorious emperor to heaven, so that he never really died, but he just made it in the firmament through this, in fact, transfiguration, which is the topic of the message. By the way, the object is on the nature of transfiguration in holy combat, right? Because this holy combat, that's what we're going to discuss. What's this holy combat and how to achieve that? How does this connect to today's military as well? So the letter goes on and says, I find it no coincidence that partaking in this honorable military tradition with a definite connection to the sacred has revived my interest in your channel and opened up my mind to the sacred to an extent it was not previously attainable. I agree, by the way, that the specific privilege you have in conducting military funeral honors for soldiers and veterans is really fascinating. Also, probably the American background, the U.S. Army, is in many ways considering a certain American kick view on the greater. Think about Manifest Destiny, think about the imperial aura that, of course, the U.S. took on as the strongest power in the world historically, and how this applied to the American tradition, culture, etc., is really important. It's something we don't reflect much on, but this could be, in fact, the gateway to that as well. So very sort of oddly specific circumstance, but I'm glad that Schwerpunkt reached up to this context. So the email goes on and says, at the same time, questions remain, of course. I know the extent to which we are a fallen kind clouds the light of tradition and makes it all the more painful to claw our way back to the truth. But as someone who wants to do this and wants to recompact that order which existed before fall of mankind, I have to ask you precisely what is meant by transfiguration in holy combat. Oh boy. So this man, I'm reading of course, this man who I have helped to lay to rest are far removed from the Roman equestrian class, throwing their accolades onto the funeral pyre of their emperor. They may have thought being good and honorable men and even partook in a small piece of the imperium themselves, but it seems to me unlikely that the very same transfiguration in holy combat was in their minds when they went to war in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It is unlikely that I myself will ever see combat of any kind, and while I know very little of your own experience, you yourself have never explicitly mentioned engaging in combat or participating in a war. Obviously, your knowledge in diachronic and comparative abilities aren't matched on this video platform. You are likely a successful historian in your own right, and you have the university and doctoral education to prove it. However, then, does Schwerpunkt partake in the holy combat? Does the universal Apollonian Imperial and Catholic tradition make room for those who do not fight? I recall that in Aeterna Domina Gentium, which is a video of mine, you discuss the compaction of the Roman tradition in which not just warriors but priests were necessary to restore this fallen world. Okay, we'll get back to this later, because I also made multiple videos in the meanwhile explaining part of this story. The priests certainly wouldn't partake in combat in the sense that the warriors would, but surely their part in the Catholic tradition would earn them a place in the firmament, right? Does the concept of holy combat transcend the conception of worldly battle that we have as a fallen kind? Schwerpunkt itself is embroiled in a battle of sorts with ignorance and shortcoming in education, correct? So let's first of all answer this question. The first one, does the concept of holy combat transcend the conception of worldly battle that we have as a fallen kind? Or better, let's answer the question on the priests, because as we've explained, this is easy to check, because just by giving the references. I made some videos explaining mostly the one on the Patricians, right? On the Auspicia Patrum Sunt. That's also another title I made after the Roman tradition, etc., in which we explain how, of course, in origin, in all like universal tradition, the concept of orders being separated was not there, meaning that if everything gets recompacted in God, of course, what we see in human societies regarding the creation of different orders, there is just basically a gradual splitting of all the initial functions, right? Speaking of the Roman tradition, we've seen how we could see it, for example, in other ones as well, that, I don't know, once upon a time there was a king. So if we look at Romulus, that is the most perfect example, and he is a guy that actually transfigured, like with the blades. He disappeared into heaven, and it would be quite important to explain what, for example, the role of these specific figures, considering, for example, the Christian, say, claim at least to a uniqueness as far as Christ is concerned. And even when we consider, in fact, the two things congruent, there is indeed much to add in order to explain what kind of role these individuals really had. Because some of these figures were lost to tradition, and yet they all have a different they do the same thing. They do transfigure. In the Gospels there is the miracle of transfiguration. It's an actual it's very famous, and people think, what is this transfiguration? Even again in modern Christianity, yes, the whole deal of Christianity is this one, but what did that actually mean as far as what other cultures believed and how universal this really was, not really unique just to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the Christian one in particular, is also important to validate further also the Christian perspective for that matter, which is what oddly people try to invert, like saying that it's the notion that Christianity simply copied the other religion. Everything was already before. But that doesn't make sense. That's a typically categoristic modern misconception, because we assume that there were different religions that were separated from one another, didn't have to do with a common narrative that they all shared and were all explicitly aware of at the time, and that we have completely cancelled from the equation. In part also singling out just the Judeo-Christian tradition as such. This is something that conservatives really do a lot, especially if you are into the most famous ones in the world today, mostly from an Anglo-American perspective. Realize that the entire Indo-European branch, for example, is separated, it's ignored, however, for example, in the case of the Roman tradition, is mostly associated to, of course, Catholicism, the papacy, but without understanding that before. We've seen this in Taoism, we've seen it in the Egyptian tradition, so that's why Schwerpunkt is a lot of stuff, and to unpack to begin with for anyone who already comes at this point with all the stuff that I uploaded on the topic, but also a lot to unpack for me, given that we have really to talk about this, in a very long-term fashion, and questions like this actually help a lot. So, just to briefly answer the question on the clergy, the priesthood. Priesthood was once again one faculty of the king of Rome. Actually, and kings in general, as properly the sacred royalty, and this actual bunch that is called in part of tradition the without kings themselves, meaning that they were the ones that were in charge by a divine standard, and that therefore had nobody really acting as a medium with God, as much as they were basically God themselves. And they officiated rites, because rites are not merely an empty repetition of some kind of mechanism, but they are the process through which these guys mold the same vehiculation of the Holy Ghost into the world in order to recompact it to the divine standard. And so if Romulus was, for example, the guy in the Roman tradition that concentrated all of this in one, and the later kings also did, then you have, during the so-called, when the senators take over, kings are overthrown, you realize that these kingly prerogatives are basically shared or distributed among the patres, the senators, because they had also as a whole body, right, as a whole order themselves, this unique faculty. Is a bit like the same symbol of fascism, the idea of the bundle that in a politically compact way enables to, let's say, the reactivation of this power as if it was just one actor. And this is very important as far as the fallen kind, because it's basically revealing the importance of institutions and not merely just one random guy that makes it for everybody, but there is at least a possibility for civilization to reenact it and make things work, which is also, as far as the military is concerned, in a sense like displaying this in an imperial fashion, where it's only through deterrence, for example. And so this is what makes things interesting, because while there is a continuous fall of mankind by tradition, at the same time we see that civilization does go up and down, that mostly in the individual worth of people declines, but that still a lot of power is wielded in a less sacred, in a more chaotic way, but still, because as far as that civilizational accomplishment, something did really work the way it had to work. In fact, most people that also come from these backgrounds that are somehow occultistic, they are nostalgic towards also Nazi fascism, etc., they tend to make this mistake. It was done also at the time, that in part is the same cause for the failure of Nazi fascism back in the day. Considering modernity as a sort of thing on its own, it's as if it was agnostic heresy. Like, you can't have tradition and something against tradition. There is tradition or nothing, all right? If, say, what you call against tradition is just people who are empty and therefore do not actually have real power, right? And everything that keeps working today throughout the so-called modernity is just a proof that something got right on the basis of tradition, even if we don't see it. Even if maybe it's mediated by people who, just to paraphrase part of the question, did not really understand what the Transfiguration and Holy Combat was. They had literally never heard of it, but can still are able to enable, of course, to a certain degree. We don't have heroes of the classical kind anymore, the mythology, etc. But still, as mankind, as far as the spark of divine that is still contained in this lower nature, that is generated from the perennial one of God, that is vehiculated and is displayed in some way so that we can also understand. And that's what all tradition is, like the maintenance of this wisdom throughout the ages to the ultimate purpose of actually trying to invert the mechanism by seeing how it's done and re-augmenting power. Remember that augment, etymologically speaking, is also the root word for Augustus and Sebastos, and so all the imperial universal power that we beautifully can picture from our historical series as well. So the point is that every person, or everything in theory, as long as they are alive, and or we also explain how everything in theory is conscious, right? And so as long as something exists, there is the thing about Mithras that transfigures into as the sun from being a stone, right? That's a very important aspect, for example, from the Iranian tradition that stresses this feasibility, the fact that hope is really never lost till the end, which is the same kind of Christian philosophy, right? That even providentially speaking, the minimal, not much the minimal action, but the minimal last hope can save everything, right? Something very different from the way providence is understood, for example, by Tolkien, that is quoted as a traditional Catholic, and was a traditional Catholic just in the, say, modern conventional term, and that has nothing to do with actually fully understanding traditional Catholicism in an absolute way. In particular, Tolkien was influenced by the same sort of British background, mostly also some Protestant vibes, but mostly the obsession against tyranny that is part of at least it's healthy to a degree, but unfortunately in that case can ruin an entire sort of providential interpretation at a narrative level in art. So it's complicated to explain people why whichever myth they have decided to embrace to a degree is never the full point, exactly because they have never heard about the entire doctrine as a whole, and that is very difficult to expound, and I'm making hundreds of videos on to just sort of lay the adequate premises to, right? So as we were saying before, basically the split of incastes of the unique order does not prohibit the capacity of transfiguration. Everybody can lead, all right? There is no doubt in providential terms you cannot single out just certain categories as being able to make it. Of course, some are better endowed, and we'll explain now why the case of the warriors is. And there is all a debate in Indo-Europeistic as far as that is concerned. Think about the Vedas, where the priesthood retain, for example, a superior level compared to the warriors, which is actually also part of the generation of Vedic tradition in the Indian subcontinent because of particular characteristics of that culture and their history and so on. We're talking very old tradition that got sort of also molded a bit by the ages in the way it's eventually presented to us, and people mostly just followed that categorism and pretending also that we're talking about the different tradition or religions, where we're talking literally about the same thing, that you just instead have to be able to decline on the basis of what happened in particular to them and how and why, of course. So, answering the second question, does the concept of holy combat transcend the conception of worldly battle that we have as a fallen kind? Well, it does not completely transcend it. As I explained in the video about the doctrine of the two natures, there isn't such like a secluding hypostatic separation between the two natures, all right? If the lower nature, the eternally degenerating one that is just essentially a reflective layer of the higher one, is completely severed from, or severed at all from the perennial one, from the divine nature, right? So to separate something like the worldly battle from the divine one, you are basically, and this is very common, admittedly, I'm not here making a point against the author of the question, etc., but I address like in the second person because plenty of people believe that. This is a very specific sort of, I can't say just Christian, right? But there is some, indeed, especially from the Semitic traditions, as you know, which is also what generated at some point some particular hatred towards certain groups, etc. That is really not justifiable, even in the hate of tradition, in wake of tradition proper. That basically this God would basically be unattainable by individuals, as if, by the way, Christ had not developed such divine achievement over his lifetime, starting from a human nature, right? And you can argue there that naturally it's very, dangerous theological ground, so to say, for what you specifically say. But I mean, the presence of divine nature, traditionally speaking, is again that spark of divinity that many other good Christians, Catholics, etc., spoke of in many, in the Christian tradition later on without becoming anything heretical, right? So many people give for granted that basically Christ could do that just because he was especially endowed with the divine nature as well, and God had somehow pre-chosen him for this sort of exceptional path precluded to the rest of mankind. This is absolutely wrong, right? Just like it's a matter of perspective. It's like people who think that it's God that actually resurrected Christ to vindicate him of what he had suffered. It's Christ that won over that by himself, right? The notion of God intervening is also, again, very figurative, as you know. And again, I know that people are influenced by the Bible because obviously the Old Testament is the most characteristic, sort of in Genesis, that there is a personification. There is some sort of, at least of language that is suggestive of this sort of interventionism and the preeminence of the law in Judaic tradition. So something that feels more like God weighing over you rather than being an eternal spring of Holy Ghost, of Imperium, when properly triggered by your own virtue. All right, that's the meaning of God's eternal love, because God's wrath substantiates itself in giving you nothing, right, and continuing to degenerate into the pit. And it is, in that sense, never taking away anything from you, because the way you're degenerating is exclusively your fault. Whereas when you do something right, God immediately bestows on you the Holy Ghost. Right, there is no such, and works, of course, do work. So, let's. This is for the happiness of our Protestant followers, by the way. But that's another story. We will talk about it because, of course, there's a level of incommensurability of God that, however, does not mean that in this sense, whether humans exist or do things, it's ininfluent, and so it's just simply pre-established, and so you're just passively subjected to that. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. And again, that's the foundation to the concept of providence. All right, that is in fact something you can adopt and that you will adopt rather in the divine view itself. That lays in potential within you. Just also to partly address the worldly battle here compared. So there is no such hypothesis, all right? The fact that we're told, of course, let's leave the Christian tradition aside for a while, but it's obvious that if Christ takes on a specific centrality in the New Testament, it's because it's believed, as it was actually the case historically in that time, and as we explained many times, that any culture out there, not just say Christians or Jews, but also the Romans, the Germans, etc., had literally stopped believing, we know this, in the feasibility of sort of autonomous transfiguration, or at least they had not lost the potential, but they had lost the spirit in order to wanting to achieve that. It's how the system collapses and decides to embrace Christianity as a way that does not actually tell you, well, you will be, we will vouch for you and you will be saved just on the basis of no effort. No, there is a collective effort, which is, of course, substantiated by the church as a eminently and obviously absolutely divine dimension, regardless of the fact that humanity finds itself within it, at least in this lower dimension, because in fact, again, the two natures are not separated, and so the achievement must occur. In fact, the entire Gospels, far from being antagonistic towards earthly power, force, etc., are there just to make the humans reflect on the fact that in order to transcend their mortal dimension, they have to be able to reject the world in the sense that they have to understand how much the world is just the product of their own fault, and so how much they have to remold the world, to transfigure the world themselves by the power that God's endows them with. And in order to do so, you cannot give, in this sense, anything to the world. But this can be fully understood only if you understand the doctrine of the two natures. Because it doesn't mean that what, of course, happens in the lower nature does not matter, because you are in it. So it's obvious that if you want to partake the higher nature, you have to simply understand that whatever you know of the world has no value, is but a shadow of divinity, but yet still the spark that exists in it is exactly the mean to reachieve the divine. And that's why this separation that people very often misconceive as, okay, so we were talking about the cathars the other day. This is exactly the most common human reaction because we live in a fallen world. Okay, let's simply die, because if we believe that Christ will save us, we can't die happily. That's not how it works. There is all a sense of struggle, fight that the church has to take under, etc., that also reflects, is reflected by the Christian embracement of the same Roman Empire it was not random, because it had actually, as we've seen, been able to represent the golden age between the last two ones by prophecy, and Christ, having been born in it, had immediately transfigured it to the degree that it was inspiring mankind to, in fact, show what it was possible to attain, as opposed to simply abstractly save humanity. And in fact, simply saying that is true in eternity does not account the struggle that is entailed by Christianity. In the wake of the Catholic tradition that existed before Christianity all over the world, and that obviously always entailed that. And that's where also, in fact, the earthly struggle is crucial, because the tradition says, as a set of practices, of rites, if you want, that in order to attain, to transfigure, to achieve salvation, you have to put yourself on a very specific path that essentially corresponds to the preconditions that allow you to consider, indeed, the perennial nature, the divine one totalizing, and the fallen one, let's say, just what you have in order to come back to the former, right? What is left to you to reactivate in order to recompose the system, right? And obviously, two things deeply intertwined, because again, there wouldn't be such a thing like the lower nature, the fallen kind, if there hadn't been a perennial nature, in the sense another dimension, so to say, that is mostly to reattain, other than thinking that you can simply at some point being resaved by it. Of course, there is an individual and a collective responsibility in this, meaning that you can't be saved by somebody else. But this will have still had a broader and deeper meaning that is never excluding, in fact, your own contribution to that, right? It may seem counterintuitive, but it's just like literally saying that predetermination and free will are equally true, right? Especially, this is what the Catholic tradition is all about. And that's why, in fact, the doctrine of predestination, basically saying, okay, works have nothing to do with salvation, or at least are predetermined in some way as well, without any merit, is yet another form of disintegrating the unitary Catholic traditional principle that really meant that. So to answer the question, you should always seek in the worldly dimension your battle to transfigure the world, right? So he says, well, Schwerpunkt itself is embroiled in a battle of sorts with ignorance and shortcoming in education, correct? Perhaps this is your means of bringing the forces of the fallen to battle and leading your own campaign, and not against the physical, but the spiritual and intellectual aspects of our lesser nature. So regardless of what I personally do, because of course there's not just Schwerpunkt here, and again, everything is deeply connected with everything else for that matter. You can achieve transfiguration theoretically through any mean, right? And in that sense, many Christians will say, but what about Christ as a medium? You can argue that everything is a medium, right? This does not take away the centrality of Christ in the Christian message, because singling that out of the word is already a way to eliminate, again, to fracture further the universe just by this truly the limitation, the narrowing down of this vision, which is providence, which is the capacity to envisage the mean of how to transfigure the world, not just simply yourself and whatever. Now, it is true that if you look at Christianity, at least say the way Christianity is understood today, it seems like this mentality is somehow again incoherent, or at least say incompatible with certain dogmas in the broader Christian and Catholic doctrine, but it is really not. I mean, we should revisit here the meaning of rites, and again the avenues, the media through which the Holy Ghost descends, because once you understand that, you understand how, of course, Christianity is not a random belief. Of course, Christianity is, as we were saying before, describing a very specific problem, right? It's denouncing a very specific human condition and providing with the means to invert that. And so we are all into that, especially as we realize how Christianity took over the world historically and was therefore quite successfully endowed with imperial reward, confirming, legitimizing its metaphysical centrality. So you can't simply say, how I was born, my experience, whatever, is enough, right? To simply do it on its own. Christ, in Christian tradition, is, of course, the ultimate model of imitation. He's the way, the path. He is truly our Lord in the sense that we recognize that he was the one that managed to achieve what is possible to attain, thus, in his own imitation by every human, right? When you grasp that, and you, of course, start reflecting also on why that is the case, etc., and this video will never be enough to explain that, you start understanding why let's say, the chance that we're given in this is incredibly personal, right? But not because it remains confined to ourselves. It could never be in the case of transfiguration, of providence, and not even especially in Holy Combat, because the act of transfiguration is not some random magic trick that you have to nail, or something like, I don't know, playing the roulette and hoping that that number comes out as a bet. It is actually making the actual work of transfiguration. Through, of course, means that are difficult to explain. I mean, if you look at what the Christian message literally says, Christ's victory over death derives from the fact that he had nailed that mortality is exclusively the product of fear, of fearing death itself, and by accepting what would have happened, because providence gave him somehow this pre-science of what would have occurred, and he molded that world literally through his own inner vision, through providence itself, because that's literally the capacity of, etymologically speaking, you know what that means in Latin. It's the capacity of foreseeing the future. It's the same etymology of to see, and also a wisdom, right? The wisdom. It's etymologically in the European language the same root word, all right? So that wisdom is the set of doctrines that that tradition provides you with in order to achieve this, right? And the more you wake up to this, and the more you realize what kind of potential is there, because everything from a metaphysical point of view, and even just on our moral and scientific ground, is makes a lot of sense. I mean, does not immediately, of course, make you achieve this enormous feat, because again, it requires a merit, not a specific technique, to achieve enlightenment, right? Think about all, I don't know, in the 1960s and 70s, all the thing, you just have to meditate and you will achieve the state of perfection. What does that mean? That is also like a conventionally mediated term. It has nothing to do with, again, some random practice of a guy sitting somewhere and trying to alienate himself from reality. I mean, in theory, it's something akin to that, but the whole struggle within it is being somehow also flattered in ethos by those same Eastern traditions that frankly have not in fact succeeded better than the West did. Instead, they tried to market those and sell you them as if they were this deep wisdom that Westerners have forgotten. The actual traditional wisdom lays in the West, all right? It's present elsewhere, but it's being championed in a macroscopical way by the West, and understanding there that the nature of power is quite the path to victory. That's why Tolkien would have hated that and had some sort of fringe islander paranoid view of empires and power. By the way, against the same British tradition, which of course provided you plenty of that kind of power and success, and that frankly is in fact what too many people today, of course, in a moment of great crisis, also unsurprisingly as a consequence, believe. Right, so because we should at some point on Schwerpunkt have that talk. We should actually pose ourselves this question: what does it mean to be initiated to tradition in 2025? Because the answer is not easy at all, as straightforward the question is, right? And I don't hide that Schwerpunkt, just also to partly address the question, is an attempt at least to get on some of those tracks, which may seem absurd given the means, etc. But remember, no mean is beyond redemption. No actor, right, is beyond redemption. So what are we doing here, right? Are we fully on board with this? And again, you understand it's so difficult to talk about this because everything you say, if it is really wrong, it's going to eventually reverberate on you in a negative sense. And it's not like if in 2,000 years we have met any person who simply, made it to triumph over death, right? If you know anyone, let me know. So it's also quite. That's why before I was saying, that's why Christianity is specifically descriptive of a reality that, as much as we would ideally like to transcend by thinking that maybe we have that shortcut, that chance that at hand, actually reality is much more grim, because we are mortal and we do not seem to have many chances in the simple ways that we own at this point to make it, right? I have a juvenile voice. I am not that old, telling you the truth, for real, but let's say You can take this as a form of entertainment. We may joke even about serious topics for like the good reasons or the respectful reasons, of course. But does our life and does the world around us, people we love, etc., like are they immune from what we fear the most? And yes, it's a matter of fear itself, and that's where we should train ourselves. And how capable are we? How capable would we be to literally sacrifice what is dearest to us? Just imagine that. Even things that are probably not even the dearest to us, we would probably say no for how selfish and egoistic we are. But in that sense, it's not abandoning, I don't know, your house or your wealth or your computer or whatever. It is about realizing that there is a gateway through them, right? I was browsing today among these emails, like one asking me, can you rebuke on the notion that Jesus was the first socialist? Well, of course, because Christian message has literally nothing to do with that. Like, believing, again, that Christ was against earthly power per se is ridiculous. Right, it's literally missing the entire meaning of the gospel. Also, because again, I still have to encounter a person in real life that knows the Catholic tradition of the two natures. That, by the way, if you attend a mass, you perfectly know that is literally contained in the rite, and in every reference, in the words, in the actions. But that most people have literally lost the understanding of as such. It has stopped conceptualizing as such, and just following in a way that, in fact, is largely oblivious of the original meaning. Right, so it's not easy, again, to talk these topics. So regardless what I do here, there is something that should be transcended at something much higher than, I don't know, here is written like a battle of sorts with ignorance or shortcoming in education, all right? I don't think that I can save the world through this, all right? But it doesn't mean that there isn't a way, in theory, to make things work, except we have to measure ourselves with shortcomings of all kind in our life. Like, it's unthinkable, for example, to start this journey, this path, simply ignoring the fact that we have ideals and we're not attaining any of that by the degree that we would like. Also, there's a constant hypocrisy. Like, we support some causes, but we don't do enough for them. We claim to believe something, but we're actually not up to it. And you can immediately feel the shortcoming. You can immediately feel the pain, the worthlessness, the sense of impotence and incapacity in all this. It's, again, an enormous problem, and this is, in many ways, it's not just, again, and then there is death and suffering, illness, pain of all kinds. So you can't simply again hope that that this gets down to just preserving your own system for a while before decaying, right? At given time, say, we're not even given time. We're giving time to ourselves. I mean, that our same aging is connected to our own sin, right? We're actively sinning, right? It's not like at some point Adam and Eve sinned and we lived with that as a burden. We're ever since mankind has fallen to the point that we're continuously and actively sinning in the measure in which we're continuously degrading ourselves in the process. Nobody imposed this on us, right? That's why, again, dualistic heretics had to necessarily blame the one God by being the first ones, basically, we're denying in the understanding of in the ridiculous belief that was some other force other than the one you can enact yourself, as if, again, there was a counter God, and this whole system didn't have to do with a very pretty straightforward dichotomy that is not between two agents, but between being and not being, all right? And it is much more important and obvious and straightforward. So the question goes on, and it basically ends, if it wasn't for the most important aspect of this that we will now examine. This says, because it refers to something in between the text we've already read. He says, I wish to convey that I'm not challenging the things that you say, nor the tradition behind them. I'm just tired of my own shortcoming, and I come to you humbly to ask for clarification of this concept. Of course, you're under no obligation to answer or even read this, but already in composing it, I think I have gained something I would not have otherwise. I will strive to continue to support this channel and spread the word of Schwerpunkt and its meaning to those around me, and I look forward to seeing your channel continue to grow in power and influence, something that it rightly and justly deserves. Many thanks, signature. So, the meaning of this message. So, already, on the nature of transfiguration in Holy Combat, we have essentially tackled the most important question, the most straightforward one. What is, say, because as you understand from the last paragraph, this guy says, I'm tired of failing, all right? We are all tired, as we just said, of failing. And so what's the deal? Because again, we are young now, but it's not like, in fact, things last forever. So where are we actually going with this? And what should we make our life about? This is the bigger picture, the bigger question, after all. And so there is one passage in the letter in which he says, speaking of the guys that he makes, he celebrates the funerary honors for, right? He says, they may have thought, being good and honorable men, and even partook in a small piece of the imperium themselves, but it seems to me unlikely that the very same transfiguration in Holy Combat was in their minds when they went to war in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan. So this phrase struck me in a way, because, and this is a completely different topic. At some point I will also deal with in another video, especially as we consider we continue, especially the Vietnam War series that we started, as you know. And there is a usual criticism that I make there, that some people that think that I'm on board with sort of the most straightforwardly conventional rhetoric, at least, of conservatism, really think I should, that feel discontent with, right? And it is deeply connected. I mean, I'm habituated really after several years on YouTube to be misunderstood, to be misconceived and whatever. Basically everything I say. But basically my reflection, which is particularly in line with actually a much harsher judgment from the side of this guy who literally has, again, a positive idea of them at large, but says, where this he's doubting that they had anything to do with the same transfiguration in Holy Combat, or at least the fact that this was in their mind, so that they had anything specifically, say, to do with this. It may be not exactly what he meant in this sense. Maybe he understands, of course, that they may have partly attained this in their own way. The moment, in fact, in which they say they even partook in a small piece of the imperium themselves. And most of the things I say is that, for example, of all the interviews from Vietnam War veterans, how many of them, especially the simplest people in all the bunch, that of course, an average person, basically claimed that the war could not be one point, which is, I would say, first of all, an anti-Catholic stance to begin with, but it's also a deep political, historical, and cultural mistake, right? The war in Vietnam could be won. This has nothing to do, and this is the harshest part, this has nothing to do with having fought in it or not, all right? At some levels, of course, the higher ones, you can argue that, of course, what these servicemen witnessed was, of course, the eventual and actual failure of the war. So you could argue that, that I dislike what ifs to begin with, but this is more important because it gets into the potential. And so in that providential element, was the Vietnam War just lost in the beginning? Hell no, right? But this is not just, you could simply say every war can be won or lost. At its beginning, this is a Clausewitzian principle, just because otherwise it would not be fought to begin with. But the Vietnam War, in a strictly, again, historical, moral, political way, could absolutely be won. There is no doubt on this, and and we will make a video explaining how it could literally happen. That is not to say to send, 2 million Americans to die in Vietnam. Absolutely not. It could have been done even with less casualties from the American side. But, which is in general obvious if you're familiar with the war and with the issues, aside from all the anti-war rhetoric and propaganda. In fact, brainwash some of the same veterans, because at the end of the day, that's actually the truth. And watch many documentaries that exist here. The author mentions Iraq, Afghanistan. Do you really think that because it's odd how especially a certain isolationistic superstition and populism want to make you believe that basically fighting abroad is wrong, that countries should basically thrive just by being involved in themselves and thinking that the world does not take on the initiative, which is just an ABC strategic concept to begin with. But it should be also obvious in any interpersonal relation or in any aspect of politics. And the point there is, of course, I developed some kind of criticism towards these narratives. Think about, I don't remember the name of the guy, I don't want to even remember, but it's the same on which, like, Tom Cruise made it, Born on the 4th of July, that's the novel that he wrote. I don't want to, it was an anti-war protest from this veteran that got paralyzed, that shot friendly fire and killed like a comrade on his own. So it's heavy stuff. It's not to claim that you can know what these people actually went through, but it's wrong to presume that what they went through was essentially what it was necessary to understand the war as a whole. And this is the most contentious part, because essentially the fourth estate believes that everything gets to the individual perspective. So basically, if you have a Call of Duty experience, you can understand history. That would be the kind of attitude. It has nothing to do with that, right? There's no doubt that as a soldier in the trenches, you will have an experience like nobody else. And that will strain you also at a deeper political, moral, and religious levels in many ways. But if you don't have a clear sort of basic historical understanding of how a war was fought and why and how it unfolded, etc., like literally, if you miss that knowledge, you have no clue about what you're talking about to begin with, right? And so this is absolutely normal, even if you look at the average background of people in general, including ones that at some point maybe volunteered but were not taken, which is rare because, of course, any kind, especially some of the borderline ones would have been more expandable in some ways. I don't want to descend into the dark aspects of this. And there's no doubt also that there was mismanagement. That it's not like governments do everything right or whatever, but in general, there is this attitude that basically from one side, war is bad per se, which already sort of doesn't grasp even what war technically is. That is an instrument, which immediately by eliminating the agency of politics, that surely informs the same war, but it's not the same thing conceptually. You're basically committing the most asinine mistake in strategic education and military historical knowledge to begin with, understanding the art of war as well. But there is also this flipping of the coin, that this defeatism that I feel in this question, as if these veterans were also simply, and veterans in general, like there were also the veterans who actually said the war could be won, or at least I don't have to blame the government for my trauma. There is something that you cope with, and also as a citizen, a soldier, and more. Right? So there were people who were absolutely great. They took all the worst thing, were able to restart a successful life after the war, and to grow. And this is not to say that, of course, war can break you in ways that you don't even imagine, that the stress, the trauma, the injury, everything that you witness there is, of course, something that you must really be in to understand, which is, again, its own dimension, separated from all the other political logics, also the strategical ones that's higher, in the higher ranks and so on. But there is also and always a gateway to a higher dimension as far as the control of the self is entailed in this. I mean, I don't want to simply put it in these terms, but the point is the following, that in many ways we do not need to separate, because this is what emerges in the email, that as the guy here separated the earthly dimension from the divine one, right, in a way that he seemed really to hypostatically detach from one another, as if the sacred could not exist in the lower nature, and say the lower nature wasn't, in a sense, part of the sacred. He separates basically the will, let's put it in this way, of these veterans from the one of the older times, let's put it in this way, as if those times were the only ones that could achieve transfiguration in holy combat, and these other guys didn't even know what it was about. Naturally, in its own right, this vision is absolutely understandable, especially in conventional human terms, meaning that, indeed, do you think that, and the last paragraph suggests this defeatism, saying, I'm tired of failing, I want to know what this is all about, and this is humanity, all right? But it's, and it is absolutely true, as we just said before, that Wu can actually make it to the other side, right? Just to the firmament. There is, first of all, another aspect of this that we didn't address, but fortunately we made 2 videos on, regarding the victory over death, like properly the what happens to the soul, or to the souls better, in the afterlife according to tradition. The victory over the second death by the soul of the spirit, so to say, and the fact that some souls will make it to heaven, not as God in his plenitude, but as a side of it, as a part of it. I also recently discussed that in the video about patricians and plebeians, because essentially in every traditional culture, the patricians were the guys whose ancestors had made it in the firmament, even though in part they would continue exactly because of that partial transfiguration, continue to interfere with the world, and there is a soul that comes back to the underworld at the same time, next to the clan, to the totemic mold, right, soma, and that, however, is mastered by the transfigured one. Otherwise, there are people who just don't make it, and everything dissolves after a while, and or at least you can argue that in the end time, even that soul can be reactivated or revived, but they are of a lower kind. That was originally the distinction between patricians and plebeians, right? Because the latter didn't really have gods properly meant, or at least individuals, just for those people who think that polytheism existed, that were essentially some hypostatic representation of the divine in the on earth, right? Hence the idea of gods, heroes, etc. And so people who were endowed with that divine power, and continuing, in fact, this force on earth even after that, because they had earned their place in the firmament. So first of all, you have to consider this. It's very difficult to understand by which degree souls make it to the firmament, right? You can even think that to a degree some will, but traditionally speaking, this is at least discarded. At least there are some souls that do not make it. They're properly damned. Like, it's just like the division between heaven and hell. Like, you either go in one or the other, right? Except even when you go to heaven, as we've seen, an element must persist in hell, because otherwise it would not really be truly there. And there is For example, the Christian example is a bit random because according to Christian tradition, Christ is fully God, and so in theory should also have attained a full transfiguration of the world as far as he achieved that. But it's also shown here that it's mostly also a model that he set to be imitated to give humanity the chance of making it on its own through everybody's forces, resuming the best of their forces. This is very difficult to understand. I admit that myself. I have. Probably you don't understand this because you're human, right? So again, providence does have a narrative that we may not really understood in that sense. But in this sense, for example, Christ himself descends to hell after his human death, right? And even though he has already won in a way, but he was winning in the moment because he defeated further. He passed the second death, right? He won over the second death property. Is also something, in fact, you don't see in the between. In fact, it's not merely on the cross. It's not merely visual, right? Visualizable, let's say, in many ways. So you understand how much of the same Christian doctrine fits all what we know about the rest of tradition, by the way. And people do not fully understand what those things all mean. They're just like, this thing happened, who knows what it means. We know that, right? If you have a minimal knowledge in at least traditional history of religion, you actually have a pretty solid grasp of what this all is. But going back to the veterans, that I think is the most important part, I definitely think that many veterans, also historically speaking, made it to heaven, right? If you, for example, follow just Christian tradition, there are some warrior saints, like about, I don't know, whole of Norway, Saint Louis of France. Like there are specific instances of, in this case, also rulers, which is not even a random idea, given the importance of leadership in traditional hierarchy, that surely earned their place in heaven, right? And thus were considered as incredibly important, since before Christianity, the same constellations like Transfigured eras, it's all basically the same. Caesar became a comet, as you know, and this is what literally the Romans represented in their art and so on. So it was firmly believed, and I firmly believe that regardless of how we may more or less formalize this, because again, there is an earthly dimension that can fail. It's like the difference between the institution and people who covered the office. So even when we talk about the church, we don't have to think about a simple plenitude of intents as far as we understand just the earthly dimension, right? But then providence could tie everything in ways that are difficult to grasp. But again, that's the beautiful aspect of Catholicism. It's the beautiful paradox of Catholicism that really expresses the limit of our own understanding, but our guilty limit in the unwillingness to understand it. Everything would be so simpler and more beautiful if that understanding really came to everyone. So I really believe that many veterans, regardless of the fact that they were fallen as a kind, did actually achieve in part this. And again, admittedly, it's difficult to wonder whether, again, a 21st, a 20th century person could simply do this in combat, right? Meaning, consider the temper of the times, whether they fully got it. And studying military history from decades now, I can say that there's surely some level of selflessness that pours through different examples that is striking as inspiring, right? If you think about people, I don't know, who blew themselves up together with entire bridges to prevent to save the retreat of their comrades, and bog down the enemy and saving many other lives in the war. You realize that in the clarity in which they did that, maybe they were just, I don't know, people you would meet the day before. You think these are just stupid peasants, right? They don't understand anything. But the way they would activate that kind of selflessness and providence is very humbling in this sense, because it shows you things that you may be thinking like, this happens, just I'm better than these people. Were you in that circumstance? Would you be able to sacrifice yourself in the moment, by the way, without even knowing whether this would have been worth it, but understanding that in the moment would have inspired others in ways that are really unspeakable of and can inflame every soul once you really understand what goes on? That is something else, right? And in this sense, that there is also a dimension of military history, which is we often deal with issues that occur in the past, but we should never forget the present, and the fact that after all the past still happens in the present. It's still just an illusion to presume otherwise, and that we're looking at same people just like us, and an entire tradition in mythology, in also in more recent times, that talks specifically about this attainment, and that is incredibly inspiring, and that actually happened. Sometimes when I study military history, I stop to, because my point is many ways, and this is not random, is to assess the actual quality of a military force, of a unit, whatever. And in some ways, of course, you find units get, annihilated because they weren't also there good for much, or they were poorly led, or there was some issue that you understand. Then you find every once in a while, admittedly, this is not very frequent indeed, but certain levels of military performance and achievement that you simply stop and say, yes, you have already seen them in a way, because there is some recurrence into that, but they really say, damn, this unit was able to pull this off? Do you realize, humanly speaking, what this was about? This can be seen even from an anthropological point of view. I mean, we made that quite fortunate video about 12th century combat psychology. We read certain battle accounts. We also just reconstruct what knightly warfare was at the time. Do you think that launching yourself at 45 kilometers an hour against a guy arriving at the same speed on the other, so basically smashing into something at 90 kilometers per hour, being designed to do that for a lifetime on a regular basis, something that has not to do with divine transfiguration and some level of, heightened sort of spiritual condition that today we can't even properly grasp anymore. Right? This is something that really blows your mind. And frankly, speaking of more contemporary realities, I have seen rarely, and even more rarely, stuff like this. Meaning that, of course, it happens in all times, but that strikes me as even rarer. Now, I don't want to make a reference to any specific war or context or whatever, but again, there are plenty of heroic deeds throughout all military history. We can pinpoint them in quite somehow clear ways. At least there is no doubt that regardless of what we think happens after that in that moment, definitely stand out as a higher level, in this level of inspiration that is part of literally the Holy Ghost permeating you in that moment, just out of the ennoblement that these people can transmit with their deeds. But I don't know, look at the difference between World War II veteran interviews and how they describe war as opposed to today's veteran. And again, I don't want to speak ill of the latter, because again, there are exceptional people in there, and in as much as you can separate, let's say, whichever cause they're fighting for, etc., from this specific military quality. All right, so there are, in history, terrible people who also were capable of some of the most heroic deeds, for example, which makes you think, really. I was myself somehow affected by this in my ancestry, because I have some war stories that never made me see politics and war in the same ways, that made me see things in relative terms, but allowing me to see things in more objective terms without derailing into relativism people tend to do. But there is no doubt that if you dig back in time, you realize that this is yet another very complicated topic, but the notion that basically people were better at the time, were tougher, were sort of more motivated. I don't know, a World War I record would simply leave their family for fighting and dying for their fatherland. But say it's not like they didn't fear. They weren't already affected by post-traditional ideologies, and they were failing and etc. But they would do that as a much more natural, normal, and say actually done thing than what most people would think like today. I mean, this is also very controversial, but think about the attention towards mental illness. Now, I will not talk about veterans in this, but just think about in the rest of our society that intertwines with that. I mean, how much have we inflated the importance of mental illness and sort of just become indulgent towards the same? How we have incentivized people to just pretend that they are victims of a system, and so it's normal for you to feel that way. No, it's not normal for you to feel that way. We should stop saying this BS to people because we're making them weaker and nothing else, right? There's no doubt that this mental illness is also connected to war, always existed. But how did people actually cope with this in the past or not? Surely there were terrible dimensions. It's not like, a person in the Middle Ages were, witnessing trauma and they were simply saying, okay, well, we are medievals, we're tough, we don't care about it. We know pretty well that there was damage of this kind because that is what happens in practice. But there is a capacity of a redemptional capacity, in a sense, in and of itself, some transfigurational capacity, also tying in with the actual question, that is to say, can you achieve salvation in other ways, in holy combat that is not just war, right? That is also the thing. You can do it in many different conditions, including, indeed, if you are a Christian, you see it in Christ that did not die fighting, all right? So that is quite telling in many ways, and self-explanatory as far as the question goes for Christianity as well. But it does seem to me that people there back in the day understood much better, like the obvious about the world, that you're not owed anything, really, that rights do not exist. It's all a scam. It's all a delusion, right? Life is life, and death is death, and it goes the way it does, and that's pretty much it. Now, why is war? If anything, we will maybe make some conclusive remarks on that specific topic, but the question is, why is war the privileged, was considered traditionally the privileged path to this? Well, this is a very important question because at some point we will have to explain it on the basis of the same traditional texts. Indeed, the latter do not entail specifically that you have to simply fight in a technically worldly sense, battle in a military context in order to transfigure. In fact, the more you dig into tradition, the more you realize that, first of all, the Holy Fathers that tradition repeatedly talks about were people living in a status that is akin to the divine, all right? And so they belonged to dimensions that are quite difficult to simply reconnect with the military, right? If you think, for example, the traditional gold and silver, bronze, iron age, you know that the latter two, of course, correspond also to some archaeological levels of understanding that, of course, are supposed traditionally to be like spiritual ones, but in the sense that literally people fought eventually at some point with actual weapons, with ever more perishable materials, in sort of with lower standards that required less and less capacities. In fact, to fight sort of less and less positive wars, let's put it in this way. The point of war, and this is something that I arrived to before getting into tradition, I got it through von Clausewitz, has to do with the following. It has a relative virtue, right? It's not absolute. And in this sense, I think it is what really makes it the favorable earthly path to transfiguration in holy combat. But because we are fallen to that point, that it's difficult to reactivate it in any other specific context. Also because the world is plagued by this, and not by some general divine order that prevents further disgregation, therefore further conflict. War is, of all the human activities, the one where more is at stake with more control on it. What does it mean? Well, there are big dynamics that you do not have apparently much control on them. I mean, historiography at some point indulged you even into thinking that, again, there's no free will because there are some overarching socio-economical dynamics that you can't stop, right? It's difficult to look at certain figures in history like Alexander or Caesar and simply saying, oh, well, no, they're just the product of some other factor. They didn't change anything. Like, they changed the world in their own regard. There is a will to power. This is all what tradition is about. But it's indeed true that for individuals today, it's difficult to leave a mark in the world, and simply having control on big things that eventually will determine much else, including the increasing burden of sin on our own shoulders that, remember, is an ever-crushing weight, considering that it accumulates the one of our ancestors. It's not like the sins of our ancestors cannot be redeemed through good deeds, but they must happen. And at most, as we've seen, we have been degenerating, which means that we have been continuing to indebt ourselves over and over again because of original sin. Nevertheless, war is indeed what finds the highest stake, literally life and more, like the one of your family, your country, whatever, but with some actually controllable fashion. I mean, war does not simply happen. It's not a natural, it's not, I don't know, like a tornado, or something that simply happens without some other broader control. Like, everything that happens in war is actually waged by someone. There is an actual human control, conscience, enactment that always does this. Even when things get out of hand, there is a fog of war, there is a tragedy, there are some things that go out of hand continuously, because again, it's something that you attemptively control, but you're also wrestling with someone else for. You're still, what happens in war is what you do, all right? It's not something that randomly happens, right? It's either you shoot me or I shoot you, and unless we stop shooting at one another, literally, we made it happen, all right? Including, in fact, stopping to shooting, which is, again, that's something here we're not going to discuss. In this sense, what the ancients realized is that war was, of course, in times where, of course, the race of the gods had already declined, was at least the privileged arena where to achieve this rekindling with the divine, because it is also the moment in which you are basically sacrificing the most, right? Going back to what we said about the gospel and what the gospel really say. When you go to war, you're automatically entailing that there is going to be some sacrifice of sort, right? There is also some overarching reason why you go there that prompts you to do so. I mean, there is a logic to war, contrary to what people want sometimes to claim, right? Even the dumbest of enemy has normally like a point for this all, right? It's beyond doubt. And war in this sense is, as you know, is something actually that goes against natural instincts. If anything, the one of self-preservation. So you can't really say that war is actually, and this may sound strange, but it's actually the most reasonable thing that we normally do, meaning that in the way we choose it, also because it's, remember, always an instrument of politics, it pertains at least to the most concrete, concretely motivated, at least, basis that you can find. Again, it can be a stupid war, it can be poorly handled, there's no doubt, but wars never quite, not just are never isolated acts that broke out for no reason, but they're also always fought for, in fact, something that is very concrete in the end, right? And that can't really make a huge difference in favor of the winner. Not always, again, things can go in all different ways, but in the process, because if you study tradition, the sagas, either the Roman or Germanic ones, you realize that we talk about the Mahabharata. The world tradition says this, that holy combat is truly this privileged dimension that, again, can be also not really a conventional military fight, as we understand it. Can be a psychomachia, right? In the Middle Ages, in the monastic communities, so this was understood. Also, the monastic military orders worked in a sense on the basis of the same principle, again, of the split orders that were recompacting certain ideas, certain practice also to trigger that realization of self-sacrifice in holy combat. And so old tradition tells us that holy combat, so in the moment in which you risk the most, the entire point of transfiguration, you see, we've discussed this on many occasions. I properly made a video about the role of the Dionysian in divine transfiguration, which is called like the path where the fire of death blazes for a reason. And that explains you how you have to come to comprehend all the darkness of it in order to win. That's also why Christ, again, after death goes to hell, right? Before finally triumphing. Because that fight was the darkest, was the one that enables essentially to confront yourself with your darkest fears, so with the furies, with the Erinnys, with the most demonic, etheric, horrifying, terrorizing aspect of the self, the one of fear, confronting your own fear, and being able to tame it and win it. So that's why, and when you do so, and that's the symbol of the Madonna, the Valkyries, of Victoria, and so on, the soul of chivalry, the angel-like woman, that terrific female demon will be possessed, transfigured into the beautiful winged glory that is the same Holy Ghost that is your own soul. Because, again, metaphysically, what happens even on a battlefield is happening within you. This is something that is happening, in a sense, also in a broader sense, but starting from within your soul. All right? And it is essentially the cleaning, the purification of your soul through this fire of holy combat, enabling you to augment yourself, to transfigure, to render your soul pure, and so rising and obtaining that place in the firmament by triumphing over this fear and skyrocketing to the sky in a place that will be witnessed, say, earthly speaking, that will, in fact, look like literally the miracle of transfiguration in the gospel, which is incredible because it is technically something that, as we explained, Christ shows to Peter to it doesn't. He starts doing that right in the desert, like showing them that it could be done. But nobody sees Christ transfiguring after death, right? That can't fully, completely happen. But if you wonder what the aura is, what the eagles flying in front of the chariots of the classical heroes are, that's the transfigured soul. It's the Holy Trinity. It's the hero, which is the Son. It's the Holy Ghost, which is the guiding eagle, descending from God, but also emanating from the hero, and the Son, that is, of course, the Father, right? And this pertains to the entire, ancient iconography in every culture, and it's literally always the same identical thing. So, to wrap this up, holy combat is truly the privileged context because you are more directly confronted with the actual threat of death. All right, so this can happen through other paths, but war, especially for the fallen world, was, let's say, in statistic terms, at least something that is always connected with actual agency and responsibility and morality, the privileged place when this can happen. And indeed, it's not like you hear a veteran talking about this. I've personally never met anyone who witnessed any kind of vision or was willingly sort of expressing, let's say, this ultimate aim, also of actually dying through self-sacrifice and, seeing war like a place where you could eliminate any fear. But there is much literature and there is much sort of knowledge regarding the idea of some corporatistic sense of esprit de corps and willingness to fight or die, in acting in combat as if, nothing could kill you, right? Which is in theory what wouldn't. Naturally, we are imperfect and people get killed, even in those instances. However, this is also the problem. Can a person that is killed in the moment, in a mortal sense, really transfigure in the process? That's also a huge question, right? As far as also the afterlife is concerned or not. Because again, a part of your soul could transfigure at that point, but in the immediate, you will not see that. Maybe some miracles will happen. Maybe some force will stem from your memory, from your aura or something, right? That's also why we celebrate the dead. That's why we reward them, we decorate them post-mortem, right? Sometimes, of the highest honors, because we recognize that they achieved something that, in that sense, seems, by our lower human standards, something beyond the norm, and that surely has to do with what tradition refers to regarding holy combat. There is also, in fact, how to explain this, right? I think that every person that is interested in the military, in warfare, has somehow gotten this at some point, that there is this sense of self-sacrifice, of fighting for the unit, of knowing that everybody relies on each other, has each other's back. And there is something also in civilian life that lacks, that very often trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder derive from, they can derive from many things, but there is a general sense, which I think is actually a very positive one. It's not really part of a trauma, really, that indeed people who have not gone through those military circumstances do not understand in the civilian world. That is, in this sense, lower. And indeed, there's no doubt that the military is a higher caste than the average population. This can be seen in many different ways. I mean, military men have, on average, a higher IQ than the rest of the population. I mean, not something staggering per se, as opposed to other qualifications, but in general, right, there is some sense that what they do is something really that takes some massive attributes to achieve in their own regard, and that therefore we celebrate, we revere, we respect, we admire, etc. Right? So, what happens to these people in that moment is not quite practically discussed, right? Again, probably there is a massive literature exploding on PTSDs, on something more that criticizes war than anything, that looks at this from a very material side of the story, does not even think to connect this with history, of tradition, with religion. As a matter of fact, there are instances, and historically speaking, of people who literally said, also in very modern contexts, that studying history of religion, studying tradition, acknowledging the actual meaning of this true history of religion, actually saved them after war trauma, which is a very true thing. And I would say that there are different traumas you can have in your life, and when you actually start embracing tradition and its actual meaning, which is as brutally as it can get, that everything that happens to you is also somebody else's fault, in the sense that if somebody does something wrong to you, yes, that counts, but at the same time, it is your fault as well. It's what we were saying before about Catholicism regarding the fact that predetermination and free will both exist at the same time. And when you understand whatever happens to you is your full responsibility, also because you could simply control whoever that can do something for or against you, your horizons completely change. It's like passing from praying God during bad times and asking, why God? Why to me? What's the meaning of this? And then suddenly manning up and realizing, God, thanks for motivating me, because now I know that everything that happens relies on me, and this is incredibly empowering. All right. So I think that the military largely sets you on those tracks and makes you embrace the risk of death in ways that nobody really like. Sometimes it's also a trick. It's a patch, and in general, again, as long as we're human, we can't claim that indeed there is something particularly achieved at these levels, even in the military, etc. But at the same time, since the mysterious experience of post-mortem, we can't fundamentally be sure that this is actually triggering part of that firmament achievement, regardless of the fact that, again, it seems to be something very difficult. But again, there are some examples that are striking, and the more inspiring they are, and I don't think those are analyzed. For example, I'm not sure whether there are studies that study, I don't know what kind of psychology exists behind Medal of Honor recipients. Tied into this kind of traditional fashion. It's more like descriptive, it's military history, not even the art of war. It's not like trying to study what these people had in their mind. Admittedly, it's difficult in the moment, but there may be something deeper to this that may be the key to that level of transfiguration. And surely this is rough, imperfect. Like, again, it's as the same letter is saying here, like, it's difficult to believe that these people had literally transfiguration in holy combat in their mind in the moment. But there is a sense of control of the self, an actual surpassing of that human dimension in the moment, because you're putting on that behind something else that is eventually more important. That Holy Ghost that is inspiring us at so many levels and through many other symbolism, including, again, the angel-like woman. What would you fight for? All right, what's for a man the ultimate goal, after all, is winning the heavenly maiden, isn't it? And what do you think this is all really about, right? So again, it's difficult, and it's difficult because the world is really a bad place, and whichever category has really mostly horrifying people in it. So it's difficult to make a categorization on the basis of profession or background, whatever, because we all have our problems, and it's impossible to unsee that at some point. But I think that war holds the key largely to this level of, okay, do we want to really do it? Do we want to really take control in the midst of the most terrifying chaos? Do we want really to forge our soul into battle? And what kind of experience is that? Right? For Clausewitz describes this in a beautiful way, for example, from a psychological point of view. And yet he does not venture into religious ground, but you can easily understand how, influenced by Kant and Hegel, that there was something deeply spiritual behind this all, and how this was really seen at the transcendental metaphysical level. Obviously, it's something that one can't fully explain in a strictly human sense, and again, we live in times where these ideas are basically out of the question. Like, you have conservatives, I don't know, talking about transcendence when, I don't know, interviewing priests claiming that they practice exorcism, that you can see a mile away just from, out of what they're saying, that they do not understand anything about tradition for that matter. And it's more like this superstitious gossiping that lesser people in general fall to, because they don't understand the gravity and the importance of the hyper reality of such a dimension. That should be what we should all be discussing, and that nobody really understands. Take Jordan Peterson. This guy understands basically the concept, but does not have any clue about the fact that a tradition exists, that there is a very well outlined explanation of very specific levels of this today. I really summarized this for the sake of explanation, for answering this question, but let's be quite real about the awareness that our ancestors had of also the necessity of this. What really, for example, strikes you is how, of course, like those in charge of the world always were the ones who were more apt to fight, and did so quite directly. This is very often very obvious as far as the Ancien regime is concerned, and of course, anti-traditional, post-traditional, in fact, ideologies tended to undermine this in a populistic and ever more fractalistic and paganistic fashion. But the fact that war was considered the only business of the higher men, as much as they directly participated into it and they took all the burden of it on themselves, like it was like the entire point of it. We saw it in many videos. Like you can argue that this is mostly what we're discussing in a way or another, in ways that, again, should require this explanation all the time. I admit that I don't talk often about this topic myself because it seems to me so important that at some levels it's better to learn about history, about war, the more, as much as possible, rather than simply talking about it. Because, I don't know, 3 years ago, 6 years ago, I would have not really explained this to you in the way I do now, right? And admittedly, I haven't even specifically delve into this. I mean, I've been doing many different things. This is not something I admittedly have come to think about all this stuff very, very often in my life, because it seems the only truly important thing. And there is something transforming indeed in this. Like your psyche definitely starts taking another direction. It's as if all the world started making sense all of a sudden, as if all the retribution witnessed by actual events was just self-explanatory. You can see the weakness of people, you can see your own, and all of a sudden you start making more sense, you start having more success, you start really getting closer to it. So I really, it's incredibly contentious, of course, if you have especially a materialistic worldview to presume to explain this through a metaphysical lens, and especially the actual manifestation of the Holy Ghost, that you could describe it otherwise as, I don't know, as some sort of psychological trick that you enact on yourself. But this is just like with ontology. Like, do we really need to demonstrate that things happen if we are a fallen kind? Isn't it better just to pursue what works, because it turns out that there is some actual force in it, and that we are evidently improved by this? I don't know, it seems to me that, again, finding the right path is very difficult, and more than else, there is always a sense of yearning for a higher dimension and a greater, let's say, attaining more, like reaching beyond your grasp, right? And so trying again in that direction. And as we were saying in the beginning, everyone has their way to it, but at the same time, it does seem to follow a specific pattern. It does seem that the truth is not debatable in this term, that you can't come from different backgrounds and uniting, bonding on this same kind of acknowledgement and actually succeeding in it. It's literally also a political direction. There is a trajectory to that. Like, there are people who just complain and do not achieve anything. There are people who actually work hard and they actually get it, and or they build their own moral backbone, muscle, against struggling with God, with this obvious realization that nothing is here by accident. Everything that happens to you is for a reason. That is not, again, this sort of Pelagian sense of whatever happens to me, I will follow because somebody or something has said it for me. No, everything happens because of what you deserve, for what you're constantly doing, right, or thinking. And again, yes, there are lots of plot twists, right? There is a very specific, like, we are in the dark as far as much is concerned, but it's not like we are in the dark because we subconsciously don't understand what is going on. We're always, again, especially everything, like the worst that happened to us is always the consequence of our fault. In every time we keep failing, it's because we are hiding our own guilt. Like, we are basically denying, we are in denial of our own faults, that we have somehow done the impossible to hide, because we know that they're bad and they make us hate, and they're deeply again they are in the bottom, the abyss of our soul, that the one that you have to tame in holy combat, because that's the moment in which either you win or die, right? And so you have to confront by saying, I was an idiot to fear. And fearing and alienating from reality is the reason why you are basically stupid, in the sense that you are amazed by the what happens mostly at a conscious level, but perfectly knowing deep inside that there is a specific reason why that thing really went wrong, and there is no fault but yours. Just to make, I don't know, a very stupid example. I've been telling it, I'm complaining at this point all the time, because it's like from 2 weeks that my new computer got broken, and I brought it to repair, and I still haven't sorted out what's wrong with it. And of course, I've been, at some point, there's some level of dependency on technology, and you feel frustrated by that. And the question is, and this is actually very well documented psychologically, that we tend to curse more paradoxically for stupid things, because we somehow think they happened by accident, and or actually we blame God at that point. You say, why? Like, everything could go the right way, or at least, I don't know, this could have gone the right way, instead it didn't. Why? Like, you made it happen. There is some agency there. This is an anti-Catholic thought, because the reason why those things happen are perfectly explainable, paradoxically exactly through science, by the way, that there is a specific causality in all this. And the only one that can actually change the reasons why these things went wrong is you. It's you who relied too much on those means. It's you who thought foolishly that things would always remain the same. It's you who thought, again, that you don't have to cope with problems, that the world holds itself by itself. If you don't do anything to try to invert this, you're going to pay for the consequences of the same. Then there is all the question of where does, in fact, life, existence, consciousness derive, and whether, in fact, there is a source to this, which is also the very traditional point. Yeah, there is such a thing that, in this sense, denies entropy, or at least finds ways to invert that, to bring order, to create a new energy, new life. And again, it's very contentious. Today's video is already, it's not too long, but let's say we've been talking about so many big things, and you can't quite simply digress on such little topics, like whether there is really no chance for us whatsoever. But it is exactly what tradition told us about. As I often say on Schwerpunkt, it's not like I've ever presented myself as a believer. As a matter of fact, I've never told you anything about that, right? Many people qualify me, all right, and they seem to have an opinion on what I believe or I don't believe, whatever, but I actually never told you what I believe. But I always told you, when I came up with tradition, with history of religion, etc., is that I was just expounding what the sources say. What, of course, there is a broader principle that you must be able to dominate, and sort of, starting to suspect that maybe, at least worth investigating in an unconventional way. But let's say, other than that, I'm here to literally tell you this is what they believed. And they believed in times where life was much harsher than our own. It may as well be that, again, these ideas were used to comfort from suffering, that this was some kind of, like, the idea that there was some better, the self-motivating motivation, right? That you can always do better, you can always improve, you can always build as opposed to destroy. So whether these actually reflect some metaphysical realities is not mine to express, because I could never prove it through human means. All right. The point, though, is that if there is a gateway to this, it definitely passes through self-sacrifice in holy combat. This is what all traditional, but also post-traditional evidence points towards. Right. We've seen how the modernization of secularization does not equate to a counter-traditional reality. If anything, there is the absence or the attenuation of tradition, but what worked for them 3,000 years ago works for us today, where we just apply that. We are weaker, we are lesser, but we also, for example, wield power in collective ways that also is something worth salvaging and preserving and understanding. Studying the history of civilization and how we managed to adapt to the eternal decay, the eternal degeneration of the world. So I must confess that also studying tradition is very difficult, meaning that while enlightening, it does put you in front of incredibly dread realities regarding yourself, regarding what you can do about it all, and it changes. I will tell you this: be careful with it, because it really changes the way your brain works. And I suspect that this is something really pointing in the right direction, but it's also unavoidably, as you understand from the meaning of this video, confronting you with a reality that is way worse than you can imagine. But it's also the only way, the only antidote for coping with the same. It's difficult, as I was saying, even just to expound this, because how do you acquaint people with this, like out of the blue, right? I've done it gradually through Schwerpunkt, so it's not like I began to tour, to go house by house, door by door, saying, would you like to know about the Imperial Catholic tradition? That would be probably I should try that and see how much I make. It could be more profitable than on YouTube, you never know. But let's say there is definitely, and I understand it's through the videos, by the way, that whenever I talk about this, there is a specific exaltation that I haven't found in any other content, and people are incredibly curious about this in ways that I sort of sorted out could be the deal since the beginning, because again, there's an old prehistory to my own acquaintance with tradition, or at least a moment of sort of relative, can't say lagging, but let's say that a moment in which I was aware the stuff existed, but I didn't fully get it. It took really a long time. I can't now simply say it's something that you're born with in a way. As we said before, you're always syntonized on the sort of the possibility of getting this under many points of view. But at the same time, it's really difficult to acknowledge that, and it's a constant acknowledgement. It really goes by steps and so on. The most important point should be, how do you initiate for something like this? And probably the military is the best way. I've had, I can't speak of a specific experience, but I'm not completely strange to that, honestly, and I hardly talk about it. But in any case, I think it can be attained in different ways. Yes, just to answer the question, by the way. But it can't be attained without fighting, without struggling, without tempering yourself, without disciplining yourself, without being able to give and to stop fearing. Like the most difficult thing, in my opinion, is really fear. Like the ultimate point that wouldn't even require, in fact, any actual fight in a worldly sense, but literally being able to really stop fearing in the most straightforward way, and therefore seeing what happens when that occurs. And it's difficult to even explain what it means to stop fearing. But we try, and I can tell you, every time you fear, bad things happen. This may not be a coincidence, too. I can't speak of the metaphysical of it, but if you start living by it, there is something in it that really makes you think. And it's not merely, a coincidence or a random event, so to say. I'm very very prone to believe that there is something to it, that we don't simply eliminate like with like, okay, well, it's just a coincidence or whatever. There is something very specific about it. And I must say that one exalting aspect of the same is the fact that we that everything changes constantly. I mean, if anything, we know that just through, say, the so-called evolutionary biology, that we are attracted, especially men, from chaos. By chaos, like for making sense of it, right? Truly solving the issue. And this is yet another interesting part of the story that does reflect much of what we act like and with which role in the world towards other people and so on. And again, I think that we can easily explain it even in conventional terms. Unfortunately, again, everything is also limited as far as it seems, and our limits are much bigger, unfortunately, than we mostly want to acknowledge ourselves. And that may be our greatest guilt, in the sense that if you only realize that those limits are fictional, they are literally made up, then everything would be much easier to deal with. But we still have to be even put on the track of realizing that this is in fact the case. And it's incredibly complicated. It's incredibly difficult. And again, invest every power, every aspect of your life. At the same time, there are some pros. Maybe I should make another video about this, because it's very psychological, very personal. And rather than talking about my private sort of life in the sense, but I can explain, let's say, more or less relatable terms, what this mean in practice. Like, how does it actually work, right, in everyday life? For the rest, again, it's really complicated, and at some point we shall see why and how we are looking even at these topics, and what kind of benefit we can sort of use out of them. I personally think that again, these videos really help. I don't know in which way, but surely they add to the positive. I don't know how many people are going to watch this video. I'm sure that the author of the question sort of was probably satisfied, because really I never talk about this. And I realize the more time passes that I should be more open about this, but at the same time I feel like this is better showed through what I do, rather than because that's the track that Providence sets. It's to some point it's not a human language, and so this is also what tradition highlights in some way. There is a way to describe it, but it's difficult, and I'm not sure I'm trained enough to get there in this sense now, but we can't say that right to begin with. So I hope that really whatever I covered here helps, and we will be covering other question and answer videos in part also on the same topics, or basically everything that we discuss on the channel is connected with this, For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.